The house had been empty for a long time, but it did not feel abandoned. That was the first thing anyone noticed, though no one said it out loud at first. The air inside was not stale. The rooms did not echo the way unused spaces usually do. Sound settled instead of bouncing, as if the walls were accustomed to listening. The real estate listing described the property as well-maintained. That phrase felt accurate in a way that went beyond fresh paint and intact wiring. The floors were clean but not scrubbed. The windows were clear but not polished. Everything looked paused rather than neglected, as if the house had been holding its breath. The new owners arrived in the late afternoon. They carried boxes through the front door while the sun was still up, moving quickly, eager to finish before dark. The house received them without resistance. Doors opened easily. Hinges did not creak. The temperature inside was comfortable despite the heat outside, cool in a way that felt intentional. No one noticed when the hallway light turned on by itself at exactly 6:30. Later, they would argue about that detail. Someone would say they must have flipped the switch while passing. Someone else would insist they were outside at the time. The disagreement would never escalate, because the explanation did not matter enough to challenge. Lights turn on. That is not a story. By the first evening, the house had already settled into a rhythm. The porch light came on at dusk without prompting. The kitchen light followed shortly after. In the living room, the overhead fixture remained off, but a single lamp near the corner illuminated the couch with a soft, localized glow, as if marking a preferred seat. The new owners did not sit there. They ate takeout on the floor, surrounded by boxes, laughing about how empty the place felt. Someone joked that the house seemed too ready for them, like it had been expecting company. The comment passed without reaction, filed away as harmless humor. That night, the house made its first mistake. At 2:17 in the morning, the upstairs bathroom faucet turned on. Not fully, just enough to produce a steady, rhythmic drip. The sound was precise, consistent. It did not change when someone woke up and listened. It did not speed up or slow down. When the faucet was turned off, the handle resisted slightly, as if it had already been in use. In the morning, the house behaved as if nothing unusual had occurred. Sunlight filled the rooms evenly. The temperature adjusted itself before anyone touched the thermostat. The smell inside was neutral, almost clean, but threaded with something faintly domestic, like laundry detergent that had been used regularly and recently. While unpacking, they noticed small things. A single nail in the wall of the hallway, positioned too low for artwork and too deliberate to be random. A shallow indentation in the carpet near the bedroom window, shaped like a chair leg that was no longer there. A faint discoloration on the kitchen counter, circular, the size of a mug that had been set down in the same spot over and over again. None of these details were alarming on their own. Old houses have histories. They wear patterns the way people do. The problem was not that the house remembered something. It was that the house seemed to remember routines. At 9:15, the hallway light turned off. No one was in the hallway. At 10, the air conditioning shifted slightly, lowering the temperature in the upstairs rooms while leaving the downstairs untouched. At 10:30, the living room lamp switched off, even though no one had turned it on that evening. Someone suggested faulty wiring. Someone else agreed. The explanation was comforting because it was impersonal. The first real unease arrived when they tried to change things. They moved the couch. It was heavy but manageable. They pushed it away from the wall, aligning it with the television instead of the corner. The room looked better that way, more balanced. An hour later, they found the couch back in its original position. No one claimed to have moved it. No one accused anyone else. They stood around it in silence, trying to reconstruct how it might have happened. There were no scrape marks on the floor, no signs of dragging. The couch looked as though it had never been elsewhere. They moved it again. This time, they watched it. They sat on it. They placed boxes against it. They left the room and returned together. The couch remained where they put it. Relief settled in. The moment was dismissed as fatigue, misremembering, stress from the move. That night, the lamp turned on by itself again. It illuminated the corner seat. The house did not feel angry. It did not feel hostile. It felt busy. In the days that followed, the pattern intensified. Water ran briefly in the kitchen sink every morning at the same time. The sound of a door opening and closing echoed from the back hallway in the late afternoon. Footsteps crossed the upstairs floor shortly after midnight, always stopping at the same point near the window. The footsteps did not wander. They followed a route. Attempts to interrupt the routine were met with resistance. Turning off the breaker caused the lights to flicker back on seconds later. Locking doors resulted in them being found unlocked, not forced, simply corrected. Furniture returned to its preferred arrangement overnight. The house was not haunted by people. It was haunted by use. One evening, while standing alone in the kitchen, one of them noticed something that could not be ignored. The table was set. Not fully, just one place. A plate, a glass, a napkin folded neatly to the side. There was no food, no dust, no sign that the items had been placed recently. They belonged. No one admitted to setting the table. Removing the items felt wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate, like erasing evidence of a promise. When they finally gathered the courage to research the house, the records were incomplete. Names crossed out, occupancy dates overlapping, families listed as residents years after official records showed them deceased or relocated. No clear vacancy period. The house had never been empty long enough to reset. That night, the bedroom door closed on its own while they slept. Not slammed. Gently. As if someone had finished passing through. By the end of the week, the house had fully resumed its schedule. Lights, water, temperature, sound. Everything ran on time. The only thing missing was confirmation that the routines still belonged to the people currently living there. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the house began to behave as if it were still waiting for someone else to come home. By the second week, it became clear that the house was not reacting to them. It was continuing. That distinction mattered more than any explanation they could have reached. Faulty wiring implies cause and effect. Memory implies awareness. What they were experiencing had neither. The house did not respond when they spoke. It did not adjust when they changed their behavior. It followed a sequence that existed independently of its current occupants. They began keeping notes, not out of fear, but out of confusion. Times, durations, locations. The water ran at 6:42 in the morning. The hallway light turned on at 6:30 in the evening. Footsteps crossed the upstairs floor at 12:12, stopped near the window, then resumed at 12:14. The precision was unsettling because it was consistent. When they attempted to impose their own schedule, the house resisted in small, discouraging ways. Setting alarms earlier resulted in them failing to go off. Cooking late caused the stove to cut power briefly, then restore it without explanation. The thermostat reset itself overnight, undoing any adjustments made the previous day. It felt less like sabotage and more like correction. The sense of displacement grew stronger. They found themselves standing in doorways, unsure whether to enter rooms that were technically theirs. The living room no longer felt like a shared space. It felt assigned. Certain chairs were never used because sitting in them produced a quiet, persistent discomfort, like occupying a seat that belonged to someone else. One of them moved a box into the spare bedroom, intending to turn it into an office. The next morning, the box was gone. It was later found in the basement, neatly placed against the wall beneath a light that had turned itself on. The spare bedroom was not empty. Not in the physical sense. There was no furniture, no belongings. But the air in the room was denser, warmer, as if it had already been occupied for hours. The indentation in the carpet near the window had deepened slightly, the impression more defined than before. They began sleeping poorly, not because of noise, but because of timing. They woke up seconds before things happened, before the faucet turned on, before the footsteps began, before the hallway light clicked off. Their bodies learned the schedule faster than their minds. The house trained them. One night, someone tried to stay awake through the usual sequence, sitting in the dark living room with all the lights off. At 12:11, the room grew subtly brighter. The lamp did not turn on. The light simply appeared, localized, familiar, illuminating the corner of the couch. At 12:12, the footsteps started upstairs. The person watching did not feel fear. They felt recognition, not of a figure, but of a role being performed on time. The next morning, the house made its expectations clearer. Personal items were moved. A jacket left on a chair was folded and placed on a hook by the door. Shoes were aligned neatly near the entryway, even though no one remembered removing them. A mug used the night before was washed and left upside down on the counter, still warm. The warmth could not be explained. When they attempted to undo these changes, the house restored them within hours. It did not escalate. It did not punish. It simply corrected the environment to match a pattern that had been established long before they arrived. Conversations about leaving began quietly, not because of fear, but because of exclusion. The house was not rejecting them violently. It was ignoring their presence in favor of something older and more practiced. Research into previous occupants revealed disturbing overlaps. The same routines described by different families decades apart. The same light patterns, the same times, the same room preferences. People moved in, adapted, then eventually left. Some disappeared from records altogether. Others died in the house under circumstances that were not suspicious enough to investigate. No one stayed long enough to change the schedule. One evening, as they stood in the hallway during the usual lighting shift, someone asked a question that had been avoided until then. What happens if the house runs out of people to remember? The answer arrived without words. That night, the footsteps did not stop at the window. They continued, down the hallway, past the bedrooms, and paused outside the door where the question had been asked. The handle did not turn. The footsteps waited. The house did not feel threatening. It felt patient, as if it had all the time it needed to decide who, eventually, would be allowed to stay. By the third week, the house had begun to adjust for efficiency. The routines no longer confined themselves to specific times. They overlapped. The faucet ran while the hallway light switched off. The footsteps began before midnight and ended after. The lamp illuminated the corner, even during daylight, faint but present, like a reminder that the schedule no longer required darkness to function. The house was no longer maintaining a memory. It was consolidating it. They tried to reclaim space deliberately, one room at a time. Doors were closed and locked. Furniture was rearranged with intention rather than convenience. Tape was placed on the floor to mark positions, proof against misremembering. By morning, the tape was peeled away and discarded in the trash. Furniture stood exactly where it had been before, aligned with the older pattern. The doors were unlocked, not forced, restored. The message was not subtle anymore. One of them woke to find the bedroom mirror fogged, as if someone had just stepped away from it. A handprint was visible in the condensation. Not smudged, placed. The size did not match anyone in the house. When the mirror was wiped clean, the glass beneath was cold. They stopped inviting people over. Guests felt unwelcome immediately, though nothing obvious happened to them. Conversations faltered. People stood awkwardly, unsure where to sit. Several mentioned feeling as though they were interrupting something private. The house did not like witnesses. The upstairs room near the window became impossible to ignore. The air there pulsed slightly, warm and stale, carrying the faint scent of old fabric and human skin. The carpet indentation had deepened into the unmistakable shape of a chair that no longer existed. At night, the footsteps lingered there longer. They began to hear breathing. Not loud, not labored, present, steady, in rhythm with the house itself. Sleep deprivation blurred the edges of judgment. They argued about things they could not remember starting. They forgot conversations mid-sentence. One of them stood in the kitchen for nearly an hour, convinced they were waiting for something to finish, unable to recall what it was. The house rewarded compliance. On days when they followed the routines, ate earlier, went to bed on time, avoided certain rooms, the disturbances lessened. The temperature stabilized. The sounds softened. The house felt calmer, almost pleased. Resistance brought escalation. When one of them tried to sleep in the upstairs room, determined to confront whatever was being preserved there, the house reacted immediately. The door closed and would not open. The light flickered rapidly, not failing but cycling, as if replaying a moment repeatedly. Inside the room, the air thickened. The breathing stopped. Something shifted its weight. The door opened minutes later. No one inside the room would speak about what happened. They refused to describe it. They only said the room was not empty, and it was not waiting for them. After that, the house began redistributing space. Personal belongings vanished and reappeared in places that made no sense. A toothbrush in the basement sink. A phone left charging in a room no one used. A jacket folded and placed on the upstairs chair-shaped absence, as if offered. The house was not just maintaining old routines. It was assigning new ones. One evening, while reviewing old records again, they found something that had been missed before. Several families had left notes behind. Not warnings, apologies. Short messages scribbled on walls, inside cabinets, beneath floorboards. We tried. We couldn't stay. It already had too many. It didn't need us. The realization settled slowly. The house was not full of people. It was full of lives. And there was a limit. The routines were not random. They were layered. Each one belonged to someone who had lived there long enough for the house to learn them. Those who stayed too long did not leave behind bodies or ghosts. They left behind functions: breathing, walking, sitting, waiting. The house did not kill, it archived. That night, the footsteps reached the end of the hallway again. They paused longer than before. The breathing was closer, warmer, and for the first time, one of them realized that the house was no longer deciding whether to let them stay. It was deciding which parts of them were worth keeping. By the fourth week, the house had stopped pretending to share space. The routines no longer waited for night or privacy. They asserted themselves openly, confidently, as if the house had accepted that resistance was over. Lights turned on while people were in the room, and stayed on even when switches were flipped repeatedly. Water ran while someone stood at the sink, hands dry, watching the stream continue without pressure behind it. Doors closed slowly in full view, not hiding, not threatening, simply completing an action that had been left unfinished. The house was no longer preserving the past quietly. It was optimizing the present. They noticed that their own habits were changing. Not consciously, not all at once, but in small, disturbing adjustments. One of them began sitting in the same spot every evening, without remembering choosing it. Another started waking up minutes before dawn, standing by the window upstairs, staring out at nothing in particular until the light changed, then returning to bed with no memory of getting up. Speech became inefficient. They spoke less. When they did, sentences shortened, stripped of unnecessary detail. The house did not need conversation. It needed predictability. The upstairs room was no longer avoided. It was integrated. Someone began using it without announcing the decision. A chair appeared there one morning. No one remembered bringing it into the house. It fit the indentation in the carpet perfectly. The fabric was worn in places that matched the shape of a body that had used it for years. Sitting in that chair felt correct. Too correct. When one of them tried to remove it, the chair resisted, not with weight, but with balance. Every attempt to lift it resulted in the person shifting instead, adjusting their stance to accommodate the object rather than move it. Eventually, they stopped trying. The house responded immediately. The breathing returned, steady and calm, as if approval had been granted. They began losing track of personal boundaries. Bedrooms lost their sense of ownership. Clothes appeared folded and placed on beds that were not theirs. Toothbrushes switched positions. Names were spoken incorrectly, then corrected without discussion, as if the house were testing labels. Mirrors became difficult to look into. Reflections lagged by fractions of a second, not enough to notice at first. Enough to create a faint sense of delay, as though the image was finishing an action the body had already completed. The most disturbing change came quietly. They stopped thinking about leaving. The idea surfaced occasionally, faint and distant, but it carried no urgency. Packing felt unnecessary. Making plans felt premature. The house handled time now. It distributed it evenly, efficiently, so no one had too much of it. When a family member called to check in, the conversation ended abruptly, not because of interference, because neither side could remember why the call had been made. The line stayed open for several seconds after both stopped speaking, filled with ambient noise from the house, before disconnecting itself. The house did not like loose ends. One evening, the schedule slipped. The footsteps began early. The breathing followed immediately. The hallway light did not turn off. It stayed on, bright and unwavering, casting shadows that did not belong to anyone present. The house was rearranging. Rooms shifted in function without moving physically. The living room became a passage. The kitchen became a waiting space. The upstairs room became something central, something necessary. Movement through the house began to follow new paths, bypassing doors that had once been used daily. The house was no longer remembering individual lives. It was compressing them. A realization formed too late to be useful. The routines were overlapping because space was running out. The archive was reaching capacity. The house was not choosing whether to keep them. It was choosing how. That night, one of them did not return from the upstairs room. There was no scream, no struggle, no sign of disappearance. The chair remained warm. The breathing continued. And downstairs, the house adjusted the lights, the temperature, and the timing of the footsteps, smoothly integrating a new pattern into its schedule. By morning, no one asked where the missing person was. The house had already answered. There was simply one more routine to maintain. By the 5th week, the house no longer needed to act. Everything it required was already happening. There were fewer people moving through the rooms now, though no one could say exactly when the number had changed. The absence did not register as loss. It registered as balance. The house felt quieter, not in sound, but in effort. The routines flowed without resistance. Lights no longer flickered. Water ran only when needed. Footsteps followed smooth, uninterrupted paths. The archive was stabilizing. Those who remained no longer slept the way they used to. Sleep came in segments, timed precisely between the house's activities. They woke without alarms, rose without thought, moved through the rooms without hesitation. Their bodies knew where to go before their minds caught up. The upstairs room was always occupied now. Sometimes someone sat in the chair. Sometimes they stood near the window. Sometimes they simply existed there, present without action. The breathing was constant, layered, indistinguishable as more patterns merged into one. It was no longer possible to tell how many people the sound belonged to. Mirrors stopped lagging. Reflections matched perfectly. Too perfectly. Faces looked settled, neutral, finished. Attempts to remember the missing person produced nothing solid. No image, no name. Just a sense that the house had always functioned this way. That nothing had been taken. That nothing had changed. The house did not erase memories. It made them unnecessary. One afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway. New people, boxes in the trunk, laughter carried briefly through the open windows. The house responded immediately. The porch light flicked on despite the daylight. The temperature adjusted. The hallway cleared. Inside, the remaining occupants felt something loosen, a release of pressure they had not known they were carrying. The house was receiving again. The newcomers stepped inside and commented on how well the place was kept, how it felt lived in, comfortable, ready. They did not notice the way the others stood slightly aside, making room. They did not notice the chair upstairs, already waiting. That evening, as the new people unpacked, the house began its demonstrations gently. A light here, a sound there. Nothing alarming. Nothing that could not be explained away by age or wiring or coincidence. The schedule resumed. The remaining original occupant stood in the hallway and watched it happen, with a sense of calm acceptance. There was no urge to warn anyone, no sense of urgency. The house did not need protection. It needed continuation. They realized then what the house truly was. Not cursed, not haunted, sustainable. It did not consume people all at once. It did not break them. It let them live until their patterns were complete, until their habits were predictable enough to be preserved without supervision. Only then did it take what it needed. The upstairs room filled slowly again. The breathing layered. The footsteps adjusted their timing to accommodate new paths. The house expanded inward, not outward, compressing lives into function, into rhythm, into service. One night, the original occupant sat in the chair for the last time. It fit perfectly. The warmth felt familiar, earned. They did not feel fear. They felt finished. Downstairs, the house dimmed the lights, adjusted the temperature, prepared the rooms. Outside, the porch light turned on at dusk, just as it always had. The house was ready for whoever came next. And long after everyone inside had stopped thinking of themselves as people at all, the house continued doing what it had always done best: remembering how to live. The tunnel was never meant to be noticed. That was its first and most important feature. It sat beneath a commuter road that thousands of people used every day, a concrete passage built decades earlier to route utilities and emergency access beneath the city. It did not appear on public maps. It did not need to. To most people, it existed only as a brief change in sound while driving overhead, a hollow echo that lasted less than a second and then disappeared. No one remembered the tunnel until they had already been near it. The first report came from a woman who had witnessed a minor accident 2 blocks away. Nothing serious, no injuries. She called emergency services, stayed until help arrived, and later agreed to give a statement. The recording was clear up to a point. She described the weather, the traffic, the position of the vehicles, the moment she heard the sound of impact. Then her voice slowed. She paused mid-sentence, not hesitating, not searching for words, simply stopping. After several seconds, she apologized and said she felt tired. She asked if she could finish later. The statement was marked incomplete and filed away. No one thought much of it. 2 days later, a man attempted to report vandalism he had seen late at night. He spoke confidently at first, even joked with the officer taking notes. He explained where he had been standing, why he was there, what time it was. When asked to describe what he saw, he began a sentence and never finished it. The silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. When prompted, he blinked and asked what the question had been. He seemed embarrassed. He insisted nothing was wrong and left shortly after. The report remained unfinished. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Different people, different incidents, different locations across the city. The only consistent feature was that every account stopped just before meaning emerged, just before conclusion. At first, the cases were treated as coincidence, stress, fatigue, poor recollection. The city was busy. People were distracted. No one expects witnesses to be perfect. The anomaly only became visible when someone tried to compile the reports. The analyst was not assigned to investigate anything unusual. She worked in quality control, tasked with reviewing documentation for completeness. Her job was to flag patterns that might indicate systemic failure, missing data, inconsistent timestamps, human error that could be corrected with better forms or training. What she noticed was not missing data. It was suspended data. The reports were not incomplete in random places. They all broke at the same narrative point. Each witness could describe circumstances indefinitely, but the moment they approached causality, intent, or outcome, their statements collapsed. She began isolating the cases. They were more than expected. She listened to audio recordings, watched interview footage, read handwritten notes. The behavior was identical across individuals who had never met. The same pause, the same loss of thread, the same mild confusion afterward. None of the witnesses expressed fear. That disturbed her more than panic would have. She began calling them back under the pretense of clarification. Some agreed to speak again. Others declined politely, saying they did not feel there was anything more to add. When questioned about the earlier interruption, most did not remember it happening. A few acknowledged it, but dismissed it as unimportant. One man laughed and said, "I guess I just ran out of story." The phrase stayed with her. She reviewed location data next, not where the incidents occurred, but where the witnesses had been in the hours before and after. This took longer. It required cooperation from transit authorities, mobile providers, traffic systems. She framed the request as a workflow audit. When the map finally resolved, a shape emerged. Every witness, within 24 hours of their interrupted statement, had passed through the same area. Not stood there, not stopped. Passed through. The tunnel. Most had driven over it. A few had walked near one of the access points without realizing what it was. One had waited at a bus stop positioned directly above the midpoint, unaware of the structure beneath his feet. None of them mentioned the tunnel in their statements. None of them appeared to remember it. The analyst visited the site herself on a quiet afternoon. She did not enter the tunnel. There was nothing to enter. No open doorway, no marked access. Just a stretch of road and a maintenance hatch bolted shut, indistinguishable from dozens of others across the city. Standing there felt ordinary, too ordinary. Sound behaved strangely. Traffic noise dulled slightly, as if absorbed. Her footsteps sounded flatter. The air felt heavier, though there was no measurable change in temperature or pressure. She stayed for less than 5 minutes and left without incident. That night, while writing her preliminary notes, she noticed something subtle. Her sentences were longer than usual. Not more detailed, just longer. She added qualifiers she did not need, clarified points that were already clear. When she tried to summarize her findings, she found herself circling the same ideas without closing them. She stopped typing and stared at the screen. The cursor blinked patiently. She finished the paragraph by deleting the conclusion entirely. The next morning, she reviewed the footage from her visit. Nothing unusual appeared. She watched herself arrive, stand, leave. No pause, no hesitation. But the timestamp revealed that she had stood there for 11 minutes. She did not remember the extra 6. Over the next few days, she paid closer attention to her own speech. She caught herself trailing off in meetings, losing the end of thoughts she had started confidently. Colleagues filled in the gaps for her without noticing anything wrong. The effect was subtle, efficient. She realized then that the tunnel was not interfering with memory. It was interfering with completion. Whatever passed through that space did not lose information. It lost the ability to finalize it, to bring an observation to rest, to turn experience into testimony. The tunnel did not erase events. It prevented them from becoming stories. She returned to the site at night, standing above it as traffic thinned and the city quieted. She tried to describe the place aloud, recording herself on her phone. She spoke clearly at first, naming landmarks, distances, construction details. When she reached the part where she should have explained why the tunnel mattered, her voice slowed. She stopped speaking. The recording captured her breathing for several seconds before ending. She listened to it once. She did not try again. That was when she understood that the tunnel did not need to hide. It only needed to ensure that no one ever finished explaining what it was doing. And somewhere beneath the concrete, beneath the road, beneath the movement of thousands of unaware people, the tunnel continued its quiet function, allowing everything to happen, and preventing anything from ever being fully told. By the time the second phase began, the tunnel no longer needed witnesses. The analyst stopped reviewing new cases and started tracking decay. She compared early reports to recent ones, not for content, but for structure. The earlier statements failed cleanly, cutting off at a precise point. The newer ones frayed, sentences looped, words repeated. Witnesses corrected themselves unnecessarily, as if trying to reach an ending that kept receding. The tunnel's influence was spreading outward from the moment of contact. She requested permission to conduct controlled interviews, not to ask about the tunnel, but to observe narrative behavior in people who had passed near it. The request was approved quickly. No one read the methodology section closely. The first subject spoke for 20 minutes without issue. He described his job, his commute, his family. When asked to explain why he had agreed to the interview, his response slowed. He rephrased the question, then repeated the rephrasing, then stopped. When prompted, he smiled apologetically and said he felt like he had already answered. The analyst noticed something else. When the subject fell silent, the room felt fuller. Not occupied, weighted. The air pressed inward slightly, as if the space itself were holding the unfinished thought. She ended the session early. In the following days, she conducted more interviews. The pattern held. The closer someone had passed to the tunnel, the earlier their narratives destabilized. Some could no longer summarize their day. Others lost the ability to explain motivation. One woman could describe events perfectly, but could not answer questions that began with why. No one expressed distress. That absence of fear became the most alarming feature. She tried documenting the phenomenon in writing, forcing herself to conclude every paragraph. The effort was exhausting. Her drafts grew longer and more convoluted as she fought to close ideas that resisted closure. She began inserting placeholder conclusions just to end sections. The placeholders felt false. The text rejected them. Entire pages were deleted. Meanwhile, the tunnel remained unchanged. City maintenance reports showed no anomalies. Sensors detected nothing unusual. Structural scans were unremarkable. The tunnel did not radiate energy. It did not interfere with electronics. It did not behave like a source. It behaved like a filter. The analyst began mapping influence not by distance, but by narrative loss. She overlaid incomplete reports with unrelated data sets. Emergency calls that ended without resolution. Emails that trailed off mid-thought. Unsent drafts recovered from autosave systems. The city was producing more unfinished material than ever before. The tunnel was not creating silence. It was increasing suspension. She noticed that some people returned to the area without realizing it. Not deliberately. Their routes adjusted subtly. A missed turn, a delayed bus, a casual detour. They passed above the tunnel again, reinforcing the effect. Re-exposure accelerated the loss. One man who had driven over the tunnel daily could no longer tell jokes with punchlines. He spoke fluently, but never landed a point. Laughter around him came late and faded quickly, as if everyone sensed something unresolved. The analyst herself began experiencing deeper interference. She lost the ability to finish personal stories. When speaking about her childhood, she found herself describing scenes endlessly without reaching outcomes. The events remained suspended in detail, vivid but unanchored. She tried recording herself again. This time, she set a rule. She would stop the recording only after completing a full explanation of the tunnel's function. She spoke for 42 minutes. She never finished. When she listened back, the recording ended abruptly. Not because she stopped it, because the file corrupted at the exact moment she attempted to summarize. The metadata showed nothing unusual. She began to understand that the tunnel did not erase conclusions after they formed. It prevented them from forming at all. The danger was not in being unable to speak. It was in being unable to arrive. The city continued to function. News cycles moved on. Reports remained open without comment. The absence of closure became normal, acceptable. The tunnel did not cause chaos. It introduced a subtle inefficiency that the system adapted to without protest. That adaptation frightened her more than any overt threat, because it meant the tunnel was not an anomaly to be corrected. It was becoming infrastructure. Late one night, standing above the tunnel again, she realized something else. The place did not just affect people who passed through it. It affected the systems that depended on finished narratives. Justice, accountability, history. Anything that required an ending weakened in its presence. She stood there, trying to articulate the thought aloud, trying to trap it in language before it dissolved. Her mouth opened. The sentence began, and somewhere beneath her feet, the tunnel continued doing what it had always done best, ensuring that no story, once touched by it, ever truly reached its end. By the third phase, the tunnel no longer required proximity. The analyst confirmed this unintentionally, during a week when she avoided the site entirely. She altered her commute, worked from home, limited interviews. Despite the distance, the effect intensified. The influence had detached from location and attached itself to process. Narratives were failing faster now. Witnesses began speaking in perfect detail while losing sequence. They described outcomes before events, emotions before causes. Statements resembled archives without indexing, rich but unusable. When asked to clarify, they did not resist. They simply could not orient themselves toward an ending. The analyst recognized the shift immediately. The tunnel was no longer filtering stories after they occurred. It was altering the way stories were formed. She reviewed older cases again, looking for missed signs. What she found was a pattern of early adaptation. People who lived near the tunnel spoke differently, even before documented exposure. Their language favored description over conclusion. Their conversations drifted rather than progressed. They communicated without arriving. The effect had been there longer than anyone realized. The tunnel did not emerge suddenly. It matured. Attempts to formally investigate stalled without explanation. Requests for oversight lingered unanswered. Emails received polite acknowledgments that never led to action. Meetings were scheduled and rescheduled without resolution. Each process advanced just enough to appear functional, then lost momentum. The tunnel was interfering upstream. The analyst tried to explain this to a colleague in person. She spoke carefully, structuring her thoughts aloud, guiding the conversation deliberately toward a conclusion. The colleague listened attentively, nodded, asked questions that looped back rather than forward. At the moment when the analyst should have made her point, the colleague interrupted gently and said, "I think I understand," and changed the subject. Nothing had been understood. That night, the analyst dreamed of standing inside the tunnel. Not physically, conceptually. She was surrounded by half-finished sentences suspended in the air, glowing faintly, incomplete, but intact. Each fragment belonged to someone. Each waited to be resolved. None ever would be. She woke with the sense that the tunnel was not suppressing stories. It was collecting them. She began testing a theory she had avoided until then. She deliberately tried to finish a story. She chose something small, a memory, a childhood event with a clear beginning, middle, and end. She wrote it by hand, slowly, refusing to move forward until each sentence concluded cleanly. The process was painful. Her hand cramped, her breathing shallow. The urge to add unnecessary detail grew overwhelming, as if the story were trying to escape its own resolution. When she finally reached the end and placed a period, she felt dizzy. The paper was blank. She stared at it for several seconds before realizing the ink had not transferred. The pen had written nothing. She tried again. Same result. The tunnel was not interfering with expression. It was interfering with finality. She began to notice how many systems relied on unfinished narratives to function. Legal cases stalled indefinitely. Investigation shifted focus without explanation. Media stories faded without closure. The public adapted quickly, accepting lack of resolution as normal. The tunnel thrived on this acceptance. It did not impose silence. It relied on compliance. She wondered how many similar structures existed elsewhere, not tunnels specifically, but mechanisms that prevented completion. How many places ensured that knowledge never settled into certainty? She searched for comparable anomalies and found scattered references, not warnings, observations. Reports of zones where testimony degraded, where conclusions failed to hold. Each reference ended abruptly. They were not suppressed. they were unfinished. Late one evening, she realized she could no longer remember why she had started this investigation. The purpose felt distant, abstract. She retained the data, the patterns, the evidence, but not the drive to resolve it. The tunnel was winning by patience. She made one last decision before the thought dissolved completely. If the tunnel prevented endings, then confronting it directly would be impossible. But entering it might not require an ending. She obtained access credentials without remembering how, maintenance schedules aligned without coordination. A window appeared in the city's routine. The entrance would be open for 12 minutes. She did not record this plan. She did not write it down. She simply waited for the moment to arrive, knowing that once she moved toward the tunnel itself, there would be no expectation of return, no resolution, no conclusion, only continuation. And beneath the city, the tunnel waited. Not as a place, but as a function that had never needed anyone to understand it in order to operate. By the fourth phase, the tunnel no longer needed to remain hidden. The analyst entered it just after midnight, during a maintenance window that appeared in the system without any traceable origin. The access hatch was already open when she arrived. No alarm sounded, no lights changed. The city above continued uninterrupted, unaware that one of its quiet mechanisms was about to be observed from the inside. The tunnel was smaller than expected, not narrow but compressed, as if designed to discourage lingering. The walls were smooth concrete, free of markings, pipes, or identifiers. The floor sloped gently downward, not enough to notice unless one paid attention. Sound behaved strangely. Her footsteps did not echo. They ended abruptly, as though absorbed mid-motion. There was lighting, but no visible source. The illumination was even, shadowless, sufficient without being bright. It gave the impression that the space was already finished, already optimized. She walked slowly, careful not to rush. Time inside the tunnel did not feel distorted. It felt irrelevant. Her watch continued ticking, but the sound seemed distant, unconnected to the movement of her body. As she progressed, she noticed faint impressions along the walls. Not images, interruptions in texture. Slight changes in density, like places where something had almost been recorded but never completed. When she passed her hand over them, she felt resistance, not physical, but conceptual, as if touching the edge of a thought that had never resolved. She realized then that the tunnel was not empty. It was full of unfinished observations. Every interrupted statement, every abandoned conclusion, every testimony that had failed to arrive had left a trace here. Not as words or voices, but as suspended intent. The tunnel did not store information the way an archive does. It stored momentum. She tried speaking aloud. Her voice carried only a few feet before dissolving. The words did not echo. They did not linger. They simply ceased, incomplete. The deeper she went, the more difficult it became to maintain internal narration. Thoughts did not stop, but they lost direction. Ideas formed without destination. Questions arose without expecting answers. The tunnel was not suppressing cognition, it was removing the expectation of resolution. She understood then why people did not panic. Panic requires an outcome. Fear requires an ending to imagine. The tunnel denied both. Halfway through, she encountered the first marker. It was not a sign, it was a pause. a section of the tunnel where her body slowed involuntarily, as if the concept of moving forward required justification. She stood there longer than intended, aware that she was waiting for something that would never arrive. She forced herself onward. As she moved, fragments surfaced in her mind. Not memories, not voices, structures of stories, the shape of explanations that had never been completed. She sensed patterns repeating, overlapping, compressing into something efficient and self-sustaining. The tunnel was not neutral. It was purposeful. It existed to prevent accumulation of certainty, to stop narratives from reaching a state where they could no longer be altered. In a system as large as a city, conclusions created friction. They demanded response, accountability, change. The tunnel absorbed that friction. At the deepest point, she felt it fully. The pressure, not physical, narrative. The sense that any attempt to define what the tunnel was would immediately become unnecessary. Meaning slid away from focus. Language loosened its grip. She tried to think of the beginning of her investigation. The thought drifted. She tried to imagine leaving the tunnel. The concept lacked urgency. She realized with cold clarity that the tunnel did not trap people by force. It dissolved the need to escape. People did not stay because they were held. They stayed because leaving implied a conclusion. And conclusions could not survive here. She turned back only because she remembered that movement itself did not require resolution. One step, then another. The tunnel did not resist retreat. It did not pursue. It simply continued functioning. When she emerged into the night air, the city felt unreal. Not brighter, not sharper, just less stable. Conversations she overheard lacked endings. Traffic sounds blended without rhythm. Everything flowed without arriving. She tried to document what she had seen. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. She wrote descriptions easily. The texture of the walls, the behavior of sound, the sensation of suspended thought. When she reached the point where she needed to explain why the tunnel existed, her fingers slowed. The sentence extended. It did not finish. She stopped typing. The realization settled quietly. Entering the tunnel had not freed her from its influence. It had completed her integration. She was no longer an observer. She was now part of the system that ensured no observation ever truly ended. Above the tunnel, life continued smoothly. Reports remained open. Stories faded without resolution. The city functioned efficiently, unburdened by certainty. And beneath it all, the tunnel waited, patient and precise, doing what it had always done, making sure nothing ever arrived at the point where it could no longer be undone. By the final phase, the tunnel no longer needed to operate in isolation. The analyst continued going to work. She answered emails. She attended meetings. From the outside, nothing about her behavior suggested disruption. Internally, however, she no longer experienced her actions as sequences. Tasks did not begin or end. They simply occupied time until something else replaced them. Completion felt unnecessary, almost impolite, like closing a door that others might still need. She noticed that people around her were changing in similar ways. Reports no longer requested conclusions. Supervisors stopped asking for outcomes and focused instead on process. Conversations ended not with agreement or disagreement, but with quiet mutual understanding that nothing further was required. The city had adapted fully. The tunnel's influence was no longer local. It had become procedural. She made one last attempt to resist, not by documenting the tunnel, but by removing herself from the narrative entirely. She took leave from work. She stopped answering messages. She avoided transit routes that passed near the site. She stayed home and tried to live without contributing to any system that required testimony, analysis, or resolution. The effect followed her anyway. She found herself unable to finish thoughts, even in isolation, cooking meals without serving them, reading books without reaching the final chapters, falling asleep before dreams could resolve into images, waking without the sense that sleep had ended. She realized then that the tunnel did not act on location or proximity anymore. It acted on participation. Anyone who had attempted to complete a story about it became part of its function. The tunnel was not a place that erased endings. It was a mechanism that recruited people to do the erasing. She began noticing others like herself, not identifying themselves, not communicating directly, but behaving in familiar patterns. They worked in documentation, mediation, investigation, administration, roles that depended on narrative closure, roles that now existed to delay it indefinitely. They did not coordinate. They did not need to. The system corrected itself. The analyst returned to the tunnel one last time, not out of curiosity, but out of alignment. Standing above it, she felt no dread, no awe, only recognition, the sense of returning something to where it belonged. She understood now why the tunnel had never been hidden deliberately, why it did not disrupt infrastructure or draw attention. It was not designed to be concealed. It was designed to be irrelevant. A city burdened by conclusions fractures. Decisions demand accountability. Knowledge demands change. The tunnel prevented accumulation at the point where action became unavoidable. It did not silence truth. It postponed it forever. She stood there as traffic passed overhead, each vehicle carrying people who would notice nothing, remember nothing, and move on without ever needing to arrive at meaning. The city breathed evenly, efficiently, calm. The analyst tried, one final time, to form a complete thought about the tunnel. Not to write it, not to speak it, just to hold it internally, fully shaped. The thought dissolved before it reached its end. And in that moment, she understood the last truth the tunnel had to offer. It was not preventing stories from being told. It was ensuring that no story ever became final enough to matter. She left the site without marking the time, without recording the visit, without expecting it to be remembered. Weeks later, a new analyst would be assigned to quality control. They would notice an increase in incomplete reports. They would isolate patterns. They would find a shared location. They would stand above a section of road and feel nothing unusual. The process would begin again. Not because the tunnel required maintenance, but because systems that remove endings must continually replace those who try to reach them. Beneath the city, the tunnel remained unchanged, not waiting, working. And as long as people continued to move through it, to pass above it, to touch its influence without knowing, the world would remain comfortably unresolved. No alarms, no conclusions, no final sentences. Only continuation, stretched endlessly forward, never arriving anywhere at all.